Well, I'm really excited about this panel we have today, and I just wanted to start us out by having the panelists introduce themselves quickly. So if you guys could just tell the audience who you are and what your company is, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm Josh Sackman. I'm the president of Applied VR. If you or a loved one has ever gone in for a procedure at a hospital, surgery center, clinic, you know it's an unfamiliar, cold environment full of a lot of anxiety and not a whole lot to distract you except for the rotation of staff, an IV in your arm, and likely some pain. So we're helping patients throughout the patient journey by using VR to take them out of that environment and introducing VR content to help them manage pain, anxiety, and other things as they go through the healthcare system. And seamlessly integrating it with hospitals and surgery centers by dealing with how to sanitize the equipment, how to distribute the equipment through the nursing staff, and how to actually operationalize it so it could be useful.
I'm Tom Insel, and I'm the one non-CEO up here. I work at a company called Verily. It used to be called Google Life Sciences, and prior to that was part of Google X. It's a company that's focused on transforming healthcare to make healthcare more proactive through the use of technology. And my role there is to really focus on CNS, especially mental health applications.
My name's James Blaha. I'm the founder of Vivid Vision. We're using VR technology to make a lazy eye treatment for optometrists. So we're in about more than 30 clinics now across the US and Canada. And we're just really kind of interested in how we can take new technology and apply them to disorders of vision.
I'm Eddie Martucci. I'm a founder and CEO of Achille Interactive. We're making assessments and treatments for neurological and mental health disorders across a range of disorders that we hope to be the first FDA-approved, cleared treatments that are built in the form of action video games.
I'm Corey McCann. I'm the CEO of Pear Therapeutics. At Pear, we're huge fans of all the technology that we see at conferences like this. I think what makes us very different is that we develop things like digital apps and virtual environments in the same way that one would develop a drug. And so for us, what that means is that we run randomized clinical studies. On the back of those randomized clinical studies, we submit to the FDA for FDA approval. And we move down the path of prescription digital therapies. Our lead product is in substance use disorder, which is sort of a fancy way of saying addiction. There we've got 5 published RCTs in over 1,500 patients. And all of that puts together our FDA submission to hopefully be the first FDA-approved patient-facing digital therapy.
Great. So I wanted to start out with the really big picture, which is that all of you guys are approaching medicine from a non-traditional angle, and you have a sort of underlying claim behind your company, which is saying that technology, VR, games, whatever it is you're working in, don't just help people with health, but can supplement or even in some places replace traditional therapeutics. So I'm curious, when you get outside of this enlightened audience that's in this room, do people generally believe this? Is this something that you feel like you had to be convincing doctors and payers and clinicians of? And why do you think it's important that people understand this, and how do you prove this to them? So whoever wants to start, go ahead.
Yeah, the timing's interesting in this changing landscape of healthcare, where all of a sudden healthcare organizations are incentivized to actually create patient satisfaction that are tied to reimbursements and HCAPs. With bundled payments, healthcare providers have to be more efficient with their treatment. And NIH and other organizations are decreeing changing the way we manage things like pain and reducing opioid prescription. And so it's right for innovation. And so the timing's right, where if this was 5 years ago, it would be a lot more challenging. But I think naturally, healthcare organizations are more accepting of innovation and having to change their ways. And I think what we're bringing to the table is being pretty well received.
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, I agree that there's been kind of a 5-year change recently. I don't know if every stakeholder in the medical system is yet ready to accept brand new technologies that are snazzy and awesome. Because mainly the clinical data hasn't been there. I think that's where we stand. And so there are companies, you know, like those represented here, like ours, that are going through clinical trials looking for regulatory approval. What I will say has changed is the receptivity or understanding of the need by patients. And so in a lot of disorders we're working in, you know, we're going after our first product is ADHD. that's just entered its phase 3 clinical trial toward FDA approval. We have a number of other conditions. Doctors are telling us that they're having discussions every day with patients where the patient is asking, is there something that is not a drug that I don't have to put in my body or my child's body, for instance. It doesn't mean that drugs aren't good or don't work in some populations, but they acutely now understand this part of the market and that there's a huge need and people are asking for this. I think we're a half step away maybe, or one step away from doctors saying, I'm going to fully embrace a new class of technology. I think it's likely to take the form of embracing specific technologies that actually have the data behind them. But yeah, there's definitely been an evolution in the last few years.
I think just to add to that briefly, I think payers have and will continue to find new and innovative ways to not pay for these sorts of products. And I think at the end of the day, the devil is really in the data. And so, when we think about data, we very simply take a position that we don't know until we know. And so for us, the way of knowing is in looking head to head and randomizing patients and basically running them versus standard of care or our therapy, and then assessing efficacy in ways that are already accepted. So again, in our addiction product, that was a urine drug screen. I think it's really hard for people to say that a urine drug screen is not an accurate way to assess abstinence. So it's really sort of taking these things down a traditional path, doing it in a data-centric way. And I think as the landscape evolves, this is going to feel a lot like drugs versus supplements. I think you're going to have products with no data. I think you're going to have products with some data. I think you'll have products with approvable data, and we'll all fall across that continuum.
Timing is everything here, right? And you're right to ask the question about where are we now, because there is a change in the incentives and culture for reimbursement. Just as was mentioned, the idea that we're moving from paying for procedures to paying for outcomes. We're looking now for metrics, as in the insurance companies would say. But that being said, I think Corey's right. You really are going to need the evidence base to drive this. And what we hear a lot from payers and from providers is that the one thing they're not looking for is more data. They're not looking for more information. Everybody in the system is overburdened. So the term that we hear most often is, give us efficiency. Give us better outcomes quicker, causing providers to be able to do more so that they're not given lots more information to have to deal with. And if you're going to give us data, make sure that those data are actionable, that they help us with decision making, they point us in a direction, and that they're very, very simple to manage. You get a slightly different message from consumers, and so a lot of what I think all of us deal with is, are we trying to address consumers, providers, payers? Because those are really three different audiences with quite different needs.
Well, and I think what consumer you're trying to address is actually a good question. We tend to hear, we in this room, tend to hear a lot from the very vocal, like kind of 1%, and I don't mean that financially though, maybe, but from the group that loves technology, right? And the loud ones that are blogging, and that's not your average parent that's taking their child into a doctor's office. So I think we need to, if we're developing new technologies that are going to be different, that are going through clinical trials, that's great, but I think we need to have a focus on, if we want these to be in mainstream medicine, we need to have a focus on who is the average prescriber, who's the average patient, who's the average payer, and not kind of, who are the quick adopters in this space, because in medicine, it's not going to work that way.
So while we're talking about data, I wanted to ask Corey and Eddie, you guys both talked about the FDA. So how do you make the decision that you want to have FDA approval, especially when the regulator is not necessarily standing there saying you have to get FDA approval, which they do for drugs? So can you talk about how you make that decision, and then when you do, how early do you start talking to the FDA? Do you wait until everything's all set and you've run the trials, or do you start talking to them earlier?
Yeah, so Corey and I were just having an interesting discussion backstage about FDA did something very strange in our space about, 2 years ago, where they said very openly to the public, we're going to exercise enforcement discretion, and so should you, meaning even though some things probably should be regulated by us, we may not regulate them, just FYI. So that created actually a lot of confusion as well. In our case, we've said from day one, what we wanted to do is clinical trials, clinical data that, yes, would convince FDA, but more importantly, would convince your average prescriber to say, I have the data I need to trust this, convince your average parent who really looked into it and believes that what they're getting is something that actually works. But because we wanted to go down that path, we actually decided early on FDA was important. Medical stakeholders were important. So we had many conversations very early with FDA. They were a bit more informal. As we have put in place our medical device quality systems, because we are developed as a medical device, as we put in place our medical device quality systems, we've had sort of ongoing informal dialogue and then culminating in some very formal meetings with FDA. But all of this is before submission. So we haven't even submitted our first package to FDA for our ADHD product. That will come in the future. But we've had multiple meetings with FDA. So I think in our space, I think Corey will agree, but he can talk to it. But it's probably critical to not wait. It's a big risk to wait until the last second, submit something, and cross your fingers. And so dialogue is really important.
Yeah, they kind of essentially said, we're paying attention, but we're not really going to tell you anything. And so it seems like under those circumstances, it's better to err on the side of caution and do the studies, do the research, prove what you're doing works. And if we end up in this atmosphere where it's a spectrum between supplements and real treatments, it seems like you're better off, your patients are better off, you're better off as a business, going more toward the treatment and actually proving what you're doing works.
Sure. Absolutely. I think the quick and fast golden rule of med tech is that you should have always spoken to the FDA yesterday. So I think it's really never too early to get their input. For us, this was a business model decision, number one, and we thought it was really important to be able to make medical claims because at the end of the day, the clinician, and sometimes that's a physician, sometimes that's a therapist, ultimately, they're the one that makes the recommendation. They're the one that adjudicates the care path. And all of these things are really critical for, at the end of the day, what's most important to us, which is reimbursement. I guess the one piece that we're learning as we go and that I would just piggyback on top of my comments is that many of our products are designed for combination use with pharmaceuticals. And what we're finding is a very bright line that if one wants to create digital technologies to complement any sort of existing pharmaceutical products, that this whole option of enforcement discretion is not really an option. So for us, it was both a choice and a must.
It's an important distinction, though, and I think Corey's in a kind of a really difficult area where it's both drug device and because this is an agency that's actually two agencies. So I'm a recent government employee, and I dealt a lot with FDA. And the FDA really, it's many, many different agencies within it, but the drug and device parts of the agency are not only different divisions, they are completely different cultures. So for those of us who've been on the pharmaceutical side of this, you usually think of the FDA as having a series of hoops that you jump through over a course of 7 years or something like that. It's a very long, difficult process to go through the multiple phases to get to final approval. Devices are not like that at all. And in this space, you really ought to be involving the FDA very early on. And you're going to find in some cases, Eddie, I don't know if you've experienced this, but it may be hard to keep up with them because they really want to accelerate and expedite approvals, but they would like to be involved early.
We're still faster than FDA, don't worry about that.
All right, I'm sure you are. But it is a quite different culture. The irony of all this is that for some of the things that groups like ours do, which are sort of what used to be called psychosocial treatments, but now with technology, there's actually nobody who wants to touch that, either with or without technology. FDA has never wanted to regulate psychotherapy, for instance, like cognitive behavior therapy. Nobody regulates it. There is actually a problem in that we don't have a regulatory pathway for psychosocial treatments, whether they're on a device or off of a device. And that's actually a problem for all of us. So kudos to Eddie for saying, look, we didn't have to go this way, but we decided to because we were wanting to demonstrate the rigor. And I think that's actually a great model that a lot of us ought to be thinking about.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about VR because that's pretty much the cutting edge technology here. So Josh and James, if you could also explain a little bit more what your product does, James. Can you talk a little bit about where VR is right now and what is now possible because VR exists that wouldn't have been possible without it? And I'm also just curious what you think of the state of VR right now. Is it where you want it to be, or is there a ton that is lacking that you wish you could do?
VR is an interesting space because you have to get people to see past the novelty. There's no problems with engagement with this type of technology in that people are inherently interested and want to try it, which is very advantageous. But beyond that, you need to see past the novelty and actually demonstrate the utility, and that really is the value of being able to do clinical testing, to go through the rigor of FDA approval to demonstrate that you can actually create a return and demonstrate real impact in healthcare. The interesting thing is there's over 30 years of research that shows how VR can be used to manage pain, anxiety, and has been demonstrated to create value in a lot of areas of healthcare. But it's been far from practical. It's been expensive. It's been tethered to expensive machines. It's been very burdensome to integrate into the workflow. And so it's been a challenge, and it's sat by the bedside or in closets. And so what we're really trying to demonstrate is there's this academic validation, but it's now actually finally ready to be able to be disseminated into the system at scale and to be utilized in the existing workflow. Because we're trying to create a disruptive technology, but we're not trying to disrupt the existing workflow. And we have to be able to demonstrate we could work through existing clinical practices using this technology to aid in that value. And that's really where the utility is shown.
Yeah, it's interesting for us because we kind of started with this very specific use case for VR. And so for a long time, I kind of wasn't convinced in broader VR, actually, till 6 or 7 months ago when I first tried the Vive, tilt brush and the Vive. And so I think we're kind of separate from VR as a whole in that way. I think what's interesting is that games and entertainment is kind of driving down the cost of this hardware that we can use for medical purposes. So the reason it's becoming so cheap and mobile is because people want to render better games, essentially. But to do that, they also are making a device that lets us control very accurately the image being sent to each eye, which lets us test people's vision more and more accurately as the hardware gets better. And so right now, I think we are kind of in this it's the beginning of the new wave of VR. And so where I kind of see it going is that these kind of more expensive PC-based headsets are going to probably mostly disappear. I mean, there's always going to be a high end, but I think most people are going to be using their phones, something like a Gear VR. Basically, every phone's going to become a VR headset. Eventually, they become AR headsets. And as they get higher resolution, higher field of view, basically more and more lifelike, it becomes a more powerful tool for us to measure vision and treat vision.
The other thing I wanted to talk about was funding. So I'm curious for you guys, being at the intersection of tech and health, does that mean that you have twice as many VCs and investors to talk to, or does it mean you go and you meet VCs and they're like, what are you doing? I don't understand this. I'm not used to this. So I'd love to hear about how you guys approach this question of funding, and also tied to what you had been talking about earlier in terms of trials and gathering data. Does that mean you need more funding up front to run those trials before you can get a product out?
I'll talk to the second one first, because it's always hard to get funding. I don't care what company you are. If you're talking to a set of entrepreneurs, it's never easy. I think in terms of the amount of funding, yeah, it makes a big difference. I mean, if you're making a consumer product and you're going to do a handful of iterations and put it on the App Store and hope to get some consumer feedback and a couple buys, it's very different than we're going to spend 3 years in prospective clinical trials, right? And so, we've raised a recent big round of Series B, which is still pre-market. So yeah, the funding level is, factors or an order of magnitude probably more than you'd need for a company that's not going down the medical path. I don't think that's a judgment, good or bad. I think it's just what it is, right? That's by definition, it has to be.
Sure. Yeah, happy to speak to that also. And I guess by way of personal background, I'm a recovering biotech venture investor. And I think the short answer is that it's harder to do these kinds of crossover opportunities. I mean, the way that these partnerships work is really via consensus, and they tend to also work via pattern recognition. So if I'm a biotech firm, I'm going to look at the 5th drug for hepatitis C, and I've already diligenced 4, done deals in 1, and now I'm going to do deals in the 2nd. And it becomes very problematic when you try to bring together disciplines like healthcare and like technology, because really there aren't partners that can diligence both, and there certainly aren't partnerships that can understand both. And so I think in our experience, we've been very, very privileged to have a fantastic venture syndicate. We have a great specialty pharma and biotech investor in the way of 5AM Ventures, really a great med tech investor by way of Arboretum Ventures, and then a fantastic tech investor by way of Jazz Ventures. Quick plug for the placards on the stage here. But I think it really is a challenge to get people who wouldn't otherwise be thinking about cross-disciplinary opportunities to understand the risk and understand the upside.
Speaking from the VR side, especially right now or over the last year or so, there's been a lot of interest from investors in VR. And I think you're going to get that interest, but it's not necessarily going to translate into investors you want to help your company grow. If you're a medical VR company, you're really just a medical company. You happen to be using VR, but all of the people who are interested in VR because they come from the games industry or because they come from Hollywood entertainment, those people aren't really going to be able to help solve the problems you're going to face as a medical company. So I think you do get more interest, but it's not necessarily helpful interest.
The nice thing, as these guys can probably talk to, it is kind of cool to go into traditional medical venture investors and put in their hands something that's like a game, and they're like, oh my God, look at these big like juicy graphics, and there's this cool squirrel going over here, and like they're not used to looking at stuff like that. So it helps. That doesn't necessarily always close a deal, but sometimes.
Yeah, the interesting thing about VR fundraising is there aren't a whole lot of areas of VR where there's a clear path to monetization. Consumer in entertainment and gaming, it's very unclear what the adoption curve looks like.
Can you shout?
I don't see a light.
You want to project?
Here, use this one.
So while we're waiting for his answer, Tom, could I get your perspective on this? Because you're at Verily. You guys are presumably funded by your parent company. And I know that you got there recently, so you don't have a lot of projects underway, but I'm curious how you see the universe of mental health problems and what you think you could go out and do at Verily that you couldn't do at a different company.
So just to challenge the assumption,
Yeah.
actually we are a startup, and though we're part of Alphabet, we're not funded by Google or any part of Google in the same sense that we might have been had we stayed as part of Google X, which is totally funded through Alphabet. We're a startup that's building partnerships very much like everybody else on stage. What's interesting is, to get back to the original question, I think there's a tremendous passion from even traditional pharma to want to engage technology. Big companies, Sanofi, Pfizer, Lilly, Biogen, they don't have the engineers. They can't build hardware, software. They can't build the products that they now see there's a real market for and a real interest in. So they're out hunting, and they're really interested in, I think there's an enormous hunger for them to partner with companies like ours, and that's how we have developed the company, through partnerships with some of those companies in which we create the technology, they support the clinical trials to develop and demonstrate efficacy. So I actually think it's a particularly good time for getting that kind of funding going and for creating these really interesting partnerships, because traditional pharma realizes they can't continue to do what they've been doing and still be successful. It's just not going to work anymore. So they're looking for new models.
Yeah, so it's an interesting time to be a VR company. There's not a whole lot of opportunities to monetize in the VR space, and healthcare is rapidly changing. The healthcare is a space that's ripe for change, and with VR's demonstration to have some type of impact, it's a question of if it's ready for prime time. Can it create the same type of efficacy that mobile apps have been able to be demonstrated over the last 5 or 10 years, that it's been a viable way to integrate in the system? And so as far as partnerships and investment, we do get interest from people who normally wouldn't consider the healthcare space because they see a clear path to creating a business in VR. And we also get interest from people on the medical side who normally wouldn't be as open to VR, and seeing it's a way to disrupt the system and kind of further existing initiatives they have. So it's a weird category where you have interest from both sides and neither have clarity around the value of both sides of it, but it helps align the people who have interest in both at finding the right partners.
And Tom, just to jump on what you said about working with big pharma companies, and I think, Eddie, you guys also have partnerships with pharma companies here. Do they know what they want, or do they just know that they need to get into technology and that they want to get their fingers into it? I'm just curious what these conversations are like when you're talking to the...
You know, it's a really great question. I think that they are a little bit like Eddie's 1%, kind of excited about what this could be. But to go back to Corey's comment, you know, the devil's going to be in the data. They are also looking for the evidence that this works. You know, it's great to be able to monitor mood with a smartphone and to show that all these measures correlate with PHQ-9s. But the question that we get is, so why not just use a PHQ-9? I mean, how is this any better? Why would we bother to do this if it's simply not going to give us information we couldn't get in a simpler way? So they are, you know, I think they're intrigued, and I think that they recognize that there's probably a pony in there someplace, but they can't see it yet. They don't know exactly how it's going to play out for them. So they're excited, for instance, to build this into clinical trials. But I don't think most of our partners have yet been convinced. And so they go into it as a research study. They're saying, let's get the data. Let's really demonstrate the value. And by the way, let's make sure that we're not violating trust in the process, because this is a new way of capturing a lot of information about people. Some people will find really creepy, and we want to make sure that we're doing this in a way that maintains trust at the same time that we're getting something that's useful to the patient.
Yeah, I generally agree. I mean, most pharmas now, people might be surprised to hear it, most pharmas now have a division that's called like digital or digital strategy or something like that. And they're very, very active in the space. And then if you talk to them, like, how are you active in the space? They're like, well, we don't know, but we really think technology is cool. I'm not saying that to make fun of pharma. We work with pharma. I think it's a good thing. I think the fact that they have actual FTEs and in some cases whole divisions that are out there scouting new technology is good. The way it works at pharma, at least the way we've seen it, is as soon as these digital and tech people source technologies, they bring them back in, and now they're talking to the research units. And what you're talking to at research units in pharma many times, and sometimes commercial units, but most of the vetting falls back on research. These are scientists. These are people that live and breathe the clinical science. They've been thinking about their pharma path. And so they acutely understand the needs, what they actually need to do to enhance their clinical trial or to enhance their product pipeline. They're not thinking about that tech. And so I think the burden is very much on our companies to come in and very explicitly explain how we can fit in, why we add value over more simple versions, not just because we're cool tech, and also to provide the data. And that's why I think, dovetailing with Tom's comment, it 100% comes back to, is this valid data and science? I mean, these are companies that are built on hundreds of millions of dollars of validating science. You can't just come in with shiny new tech and hope to do a quick deal. There has to be deep science underneath. So, you know, I'm not going to go into numbers, but when we have a deal with Pfizer Pharmaceuticals in Alzheimer's, the diligence process behind that would astound you. You know, both the amount of time and money that went into that to run a semi-large scale study in Alzheimer's. But it's because there's tons of vetting, and these companies are used to doing that before they greenlight anything, no matter how big or small.
I think just building onto the comments here, when it comes to pharma's involvement in tech, I think we're absolutely at a convergence. So, you know, we've been out talking to these FTEs who are the tech FTEs within pharma. We've been having those conversations for 4 years. I think 3 years ago, pharma would look at us straight in the eye and say, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I think 2 years ago, they said, that's kind of cool. What's the business model? What in the world are you going to do with it? I think this year, we all need to have a digital presence, and we're moving there. And I think next year, the story is going to be that we come to them, and then they think it was their idea in the first place. So I really think that we're there. I think that this idea of tech-enabled clinical studies and the idea of tech-enhanced pharmaceuticals is sort of inevitable. And I think in the process of showing the efficacy data and in the process of demonstrating the business model, I think they're all going to be there, and it's just sort of a question of when and in what order.
Yeah, this whole idea that we hear more and more from companies that they want to go beyond the pill. That's kind of the term of art in many of these, at least the R&D divisions. And it goes back to how we started the conversation, recognizing that as we go forward, at least in the United States, people are going to be paid for outcomes, not for pills. And so as a company, if you're looking for building your business, you're thinking, all right, we're not going to be limiting ourselves. Let's take any options we can find. And technology is a new option that for them makes a lot of sense.
So I want to open up to audience questions soon, so start thinking about questions. But I'm going to ask one more question here, which is, what are the potential downsides or side effects? Are there things that you're starting to see over time when using technology that you might need to be aware of? Whether it's something that, you know, as Tom mentioned just now, is maybe not measurable, which is having to think about trust with patients and what they think about data being gathered in ways they hadn't before, or are there physical side effects from VR that we have not yet seen that could emerge? So I'm just curious to explore potential downsides, because we've just been talking about how this is all great. So I want to hear the flip side from you guys.
In a world where in VR there aren't standards, there aren't ways to standardize how data is collected and measured and how efficacy and ROI are demonstrated, it's really easy for one poor experience in a health system to poison the well. And so it's really important to go in understanding the science and methodical nature and how you actually operate as a medical company, not just as a cool technology. Again, getting past the novelty, the utility. Because as a lot of companies come to the market seeing the opportunity for VR in healthcare, it's really easy for it to be seen as just another fad, or worse yet, to have a bad experience that causes motion sickness or adverse side effects. There are right ways and wrong ways of doing that, and it's a huge challenge to be able to manage those risk factors. And I really admire how your companies have gone treating it like a biotech pharma company, because I think it really requires, even if you don't go through the FDA regulatory process, you need that same mentality to really show the data and demonstrate the value before you just haphazardly offer it to patients who are in vulnerable positions.
Yeah, I really like that answer. I would add to it that this is a time to manage expectations. I've been doing mental health research. I'm a psychiatrist, so either care or research for longer than most people in this room have been alive. And I've been able to watch 3 generations of drugs, 2 or 3 generations of psychotherapies, multiple presidential commissions, an incredible number of things that have been tried by so many different parties with a different kind of approach. And over that time, the suicide rate has continued to increase. The number of people who are not getting well with serious mental illness continues to increase. And everything we have done here has failed to really bend the curve. So I think it's important not to promise that suddenly a smartphone app is going to make a difference. It's maybe going to have some impact in an area that's targeted appropriately, but we've got to manage expectations. We can't overpromise. We've got to be really clear about where the use case is, how it would be used perhaps to increase efficiency, to extend the caregiver's reach, to provide more immediate access. There are things it can do, but we've got to be awfully careful now to make sure people don't expect too much of what is really just one more attempt to take care of a very, very difficult, complex problem.
I think, totally agree. The way we run clinical trials, we're looking at efficacy and safety. I think just because these technologies are new tech doesn't mean that all of a sudden we get to say, okay, there's no safety concern, let's throw out that category. There's, of course, safety concerns. We'll have a much better profile than your average drug, of course, but put a technology like ours in the hands of someone with moderate to severe depression. Put something in the hands of someone, I'm sure Corey and his team have thought about this, in substance use, and something that has a bad experience or improperly leads someone down a path that they weren't thinking about in depression, in substance use, I mean, in a number of disorders, there's some very real consequences to those types of experiences that need to be addressed. I think there was an interesting article, Corey can quote it better than me, I'm sure, in substance use. There was an app that was deployed at colleges, and they found that actually, after the period of time that the study was run, people were binge drinking more than they were before, because monitoring that led kind of to gamifying behavior. And I mean, there's just, it's silly, and we're all like, yeah, of course, right? That's kind of obvious. But just because it's tech, I mean, the number one thing that we take away here is just because it's tech and just because it's not going in your body doesn't mean that there's not a safety profile. So what we want to do for patients is give them something that is effective, that can help them, but also give them something that won't hurt them. And I think we have to measure both of those things.
Absolutely. I think I would agree with everything that I heard here. You know, very simply, we're not a health and wellness company. We are treating very sick people. And for those very sick people, there are potentially bad outcomes that are adverse events and severe adverse events. In all of our studies, we monitor AEs in the same way that you would in a drug study. They're all independently adjudicated by a third party. You know, the elephant in the room in a lot of these patients is suicidality, homicidality, and in substance use, overdose. Really being able to quantitatively describe that the two arms were not different and that safety was apparent in the study is sort of something that in a very truthy way, I think a lot of folks around the Valley would say, you know, it's an app, what harm could it possibly do? But I think there is a lot of value in demonstrating that explicitly.
Yeah, I think there's also kind of a mentality, especially coming from the tech side of things, to just kind of market aggressively, push it as far as you can, as quickly as you can. And I think if you're you know, a medical company, you should probably do the exact opposite of that and say, you know, exactly where you are, kind of report exactly what you know at the level you know it. And people tend to, you know, understand that, one. And I think people respect that as well, just kind of saying, this is where we're at, this is where we hope to be, and be really, really clear about that, and don't kind of pass the bounds where it's exaggerating or coming on a little too strong like you might in a pure tech company.
I think by way of just a very quick anecdote, we had this hilarious conversation with the top 3 Silicon Valley VC, totally on board, totally interested in what we were doing, and 45 minutes into the conversation looked at me dead in the eye and said, so FDA, that's slower, right? And I think that just sort of gives you the sense for what it's like to sort of bridge these disciplines, how very smart people don't necessarily understand all of the components of your business, and how it's very different to pitch tech versus med tech.
So I've been told that there are mics for the audience. There are. Great. So does anybody have a question in the audience that you'd like to ask?
This is a comment and a question. We're talking about kids and we're talking about negative and positive side effects. The kids love tech and they're loving games. They love to put on their headsets. They're probably the future of this, certainly if we're looking ahead for VR 10, 20, 15 years from now. They're going to like this more, but yet we are looking at the side effects of VR for kids. So are some of these studies, or a lot of the studies that you folks are doing up here, just on kids?
So we have 3 clinical studies with Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And I would say the way we're backing into it is they're very conservative in terms of their recruitment profile. And especially in VR, there's a lot of boundaries around age limitations, particularly because the technology we're used is managed by Oculus and they have privacy requirements. And so although we're able to recruit people of all ages, we tend to start with a much more conservative age set of 12 above, then backing slowly into younger demographics, because it really is, it's important to consider the worst case scenario, and we want to methodically understand the value of VR, but also mitigate our risk as we take on different populations. And so it does force us to be a little more cautious with kids. Even though there's receptivity to it, it forces us to approach it a little more conservatively.
The mic is being passed back there right now.
Hi, I'm Brandon Staglin of One Mind. So It's been shown that, well, first let me say there's a lot of cool and very exciting innovative technology that you've talked about today, and I do see a lot of potential for it. But as Tom was saying, Dr. Insel was saying, there's a large need for faster progress in this area than is being made today for patient benefit and for the benefit of the families of the patients. So as studies some recent studies have demonstrated, such as the RAISE study, the Recovery After Initial Schizophrenia Episode, and the NAPLES study, both funded by the NIMH, the TBI, the TRACK TBI study, which is a 13-university consortium, and the TED Institute, the TED Endpoints Development Study, which is another TBI consortium. All these studies are making progress much faster than individual universities and research facilities could make progress by themselves. And they're also getting a lot more funding to do that research, which can enable them to go even faster going forward. I understand the need for companies to preserve their proprietary data, but would there be a potential, do you think, for companies to share their data to enable research to happen even faster across the entire community of research being done? And there's an example of this in Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceutical opening up its clinical trial data as of a couple of years ago to the general public and general public to access and see. What are your thoughts on this?
So, you know, the culture's changed quite a bit in areas that are considered pre-competitive. So particularly in the development of biomarkers, you see public-private partnerships that are moving the field along at a really brisk clip. This happened with ADNI, the big Alzheimer's project. That's happening in a bunch of other areas. In the EU, we have the IMI initiative, which is just launching with their first meeting in a couple of weeks, the RADAR initiative, which is actually exactly the kind of things we've been talking about. It's using technology for remote assessment of depression and other mental health problems and CNS problems. And that will be along in this spirit. It'll be a public-private consortium, European-based in this case, but with lots of shared data, open access, very much an open science model. I don't think you're going to see that so much on the treatment development side yet, because those are more of the crown jewels. But certainly for biomarker data, I think we now understand that we all win if everybody shares. If we don't share, nobody wins.
I don't know where the mic's gone, but there's some questions. Oh, there you go.
Can you all talk a little bit more about how you internally think about the two different rates of speed of going through a healthcare approval and reimbursement, a code approval process, and the rate, it seems to be accelerating of hardware and software, right? So many changes even within VR. Within 3 months is a lifetime now. What capabilities are enabled, and how you're thinking about your products, how do you keep them up to speed? Because by the time you get through FDA, your whole hardware and software could be outdated.
They are different. They're very different, no question about it. We're talking about 2, 3, 4, 5 years in some cases to get through a medical device path, for instance, or go through multiple clinical trials. That's still significantly faster than drugs, but it's slower by orders of magnitude, considering I have like an iPhone 6S in my pocket and there's going to be 2 more by the time our clinical trials finish. So I think the important thing, and some of us up here and some of the companies out there are really working on this, is making sure that what you have is the effect is not tied to one very specific device. Does that mean that the burden is on us to test on every possible device across the types of devices that are out there every time there's a new version? No, I think that would be crazy. I think everyone, including the FDA, would agree that's crazy. But there has to be some believability and some clinical data, I believe, to the fact that what you have is somewhat platform independent. So we're working through that process now, which is how do we demonstrate platform independence while at the same time not putting the burden on us that, for instance, we have to research every possible device out there. But I do think there's a path, a middle ground there where people, regulators, the ecosystem of medicine is not necessarily going to hold up that misfit in timing. I think there are ways to navigate it.
It's a great question. I think we faced this a lot when I was at the NIH in terms of trying to fund this kind of technology, because they're just 2 different time courses, right? It would take from the time that you put out an RFA to the first funding at the most accelerated pace would probably be 18 months, more likely 24 to 36 months. So that simply doesn't work for the generation time of the technology. But it's the same issue for doing an RCT, which is usually, if you do a more traditional RCT, like a drug study, you're talking about 2, 3, 4, 5 years by the time you get results. And very little of this technology is going to be the same 4 years out, 3 years out. So we really struggled with this a lot at the NIH. And as Eddie said, the attempt was to say, let's make it platform independent. But the reality was often very difficult to do because you had a project reviewed based on a particular set of specs. And then by the time the project was being ready to get paid, that was like 2 versions ago, and the company was on to something very different. I'm not sure we ever quite solved that, and it continues to be a problem that tells you that we need to look at new mechanisms for funding or new streams of funding so that you don't get caught in this bind of being so slow when you're trying to keep up with a field that's moving so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it makes private funding more attractive than government funding because you apply for the grant and then you're at least 4 to 6 months away from hearing back. And then once you hear back, if it's all good, if it's all perfect, you can't even really start spending the money for like another year.
And you're doing something completely different by then.
Yeah. So I think it is important to kind of focus on where the value you're creating is. If it's totally dependent on that specific device, you're probably going to have a hard time. Versus like the way we're looking at it, we're sort of assuming a certain progression in VR technology, and that our fundamentals don't change across different VR devices. It may unlock new abilities for us, new capabilities for us, but it doesn't. We're not sort of fundamentally locked to a single device. And so I think the regulatory structures have to reflect that.
I think the other important thing that you'll note probably with all of us up here is I don't think any of us are developing our own systems from scratch. We're all developing systems that are leveraging what's out there. And there's a very strategic reason for that. There's a reason we're all doing that, is that we want to stay at the edge of the curve. And so, it's a great question. Have we solved it? Maybe not 100%, but I think we're getting closer.
Great. I think we have time for maybe just 2 more questions. And I don't know where you have the mic. There you go.
I have the mic. Thanks. Greg Simpson. And thanks for a very insightful panel discussion. You guys have talked about therapeutics applied to serious disorders, very important. And I'm curious to hear what you would say about developing therapeutics for the subclinical population and preventative medicine.
I might jump in there. I mean, that's very much what Verily is about. It's trying to actually redefine how we understand risk and thinking about how to reach large numbers of people to identify either through digital phenotypes or through some other means of measurement who's going to be at highest risk for diabetes, heart disease, depression, risk for suicide, a whole range of bad outcomes. It's hard to do prevention science. It takes a long time. You're in the business of trying to prove that something didn't happen, and that's never easy to do. But I do think it's a place where technology can help us because it can allow us to scale. We can now do projects collecting good data on tens of thousands as opposed to a few hundred. And if the task is to identify something not happening, large numbers helps you. Because then even for rare events like suicide, you have a chance to actually demonstrate that. So I'm hopeful that this is actually the way that we can really push prevention science in a new direction.
Yeah, I agree. Your typical in-clinic clinical trial path, I think, is just not a very good reality for companies looking at prevention. I think that's, tech has this, and we're doing the same thing for treatment of DSM conditions. We should have had this as the first discussion. We could have talked about RDoC and maybe DSM changing over time. But for
next year, we'll do that
next year. That'll be our panel. For the treatment of conditions that are existing, we're still very big advocates of at least today, your traditional clinical trials because the system knows that. It's honestly, for a small company, not a reality to do those types of studies without doing more remote scaling and data gathering. And so on the prevention path, that's the angle we're going.
Yeah, we're quite interested in it as well. And I think one of the key parts of this is that right now it's very expensive to collect the data, so it's collected infrequently, in person, physically. And so if you can really massively decrease the cost of collecting the data, even if it's of lower quality, a high volume of lower quality data, that you can relate back, to real outcomes. Should be helpful in helping us identify, progression of certain diseases earlier rather than later. And in certain visual diseases, it matters a lot to catch it quickly. And so we kind of, imagine a time where everyone already has the phones and you can kind of regularly check up on your vision, and we'll develop a profile for what you might be at risk at, and that kind of, would inform how often to go into the clinic and get that more expensive, higher quality data, which will actually help you make the determination.
All right, let's take one last question.
Hi, my name is Rashi Abramson. I'm from the XTech Hackathon. My question is, it's hard to regulate, start to go through the FDA regulations and get all the tech aligned. So I'm wondering, how do you evaluate, as a consumer, what tech is more like real than the other ones that haven't gone through the FDA sort of process? Thank you.
I'm going to say that's a great question, and I think it's very hard. I don't know if anyone up here has any.
We have this conversation at least once a day in my shop. It's one of the things we are actually hoping to address. There is currently no navigator. There's no simple way to identify amongst the over 1,000 apps that are available on the within Google Play or within the Apple Store. There's no way to sort it out and identify what's best for you specifically. There's no consumer reports. There's no really anything that would be equivalent to a Yelp. There could be. That's one of the things that we would love to develop over the next few months. And I think there's a real need to get something to help consumers identify how to navigate this sea of apps that are out there. There's one more hand out here.
There's one more hand.
Oh, Brendan, were you going to talk about CyberGuide?
CyberGuide.
Yeah. So CyberGuide, I'll say a little bit about it. So there is something called CyberGuide, P-S-Y-B-E-R guide, which you can Google that and you'll get to it. And but it's a great opportunity and a great effort to try to provide some of this, but it's been difficult to keep up, and they're struggling because there's just so much coming in. It's very hard to curate, but that's probably the best attempt.
My question is, even if there's, and I'm biased in my answer here, but even if there is a good navigator on the front end, without sort of the quality of data on the back end of each of those, how do you make that determination? I still think that answer is unclear.
Yeah.
I would totally agree, and I think this is a place where the government is our friend and regulators are our friends. And again, to sort of take this back to the drugs versus supplements dichotomy, and I'm sure that people in the audience have seen some of the literature showing that usually what's in the bottle isn't what's in the bottle or what it says on the bottle. And so, this is a place where having regulators in place is really important for quality assurance, is really important for being able to verify claims. And I think there are probably two camps, regulated and unregulated. And within unregulated, sure, there are lots of different shades of gray. I'm just not sure how to tell you which one to go with.
I think one quick thing that helps as a consumer, it doesn't totally solve the problem or anything like that, but if you read reporting on a paper, just go and read the abstract of the paper. And it often will say something either slightly or substantially different than the reporting. And that helps to kind of cut through some of the exaggeration and hype, I guess, surrounding some of the new research.
But I mean, ideally, we should be using technology to answer the question, right? We should crowdsource exactly the question you ask and get 10 million users to tell us what has value. and let the next 10 million users benefit from that. So I think it's an answerable question. It just hasn't been done yet. And unfortunately, I don't think it will be done by a government agency. Although while I was in government, we tried to make that happen. It's not going to happen, believe me, especially at this point in time. So it's going to require all of us as a community to do it for ourselves. And if we don't do it for ourselves, we have ourselves to blame when people complain that there's no rigor here.
It is, and the barriers of entry are lower and lower to bring technology to fruition. And so it really does come down to us to be the gatekeepers of standards and to really be advocates of testing and validation and to show that what we're doing is legitimate and identifying when that's not the case, because it's not going to be done for us.
Topic for X-Tech next year. Yeah. This is a really good question.
Great. Well, thanks so much to the panelists. Really appreciate your time, and thanks to the audience for your questions as well.